Joe Biden's projected win of the 2020 US presidential election has largely been welcomed by America's traditional allies in the Indo-Pacific region and Europe as a return to the international norms that define the US-led Western world. But if they believe that the world we return to will be once how it was, they might be in for a disappointment. Over the past 4 years, the state of the world order has often been described with words like division, polarization and ultranationalism, which many suggest was aggravated by the presidency of Mr. Donald Trump. So will Joe Biden be able to restore America's global leadership as he pledged to do during his campaign? Joining us today for the discussion is Erik Brattberg, Director of the Europe Programme and Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We also welcome back Peter Rowe, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and former Director of Research in the Office of George W. Bush. It's lovely to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with you, Mr. Brattberg. Now, while most of the world is welcoming Joe Biden's upcoming presidency, is it somewhat naive to think that the president-elect can simply recommit to a few global frameworks, shake hands with a couple of leaders of allied countries and expect to return to the heydays of the US-led world order? I mean, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that Joe Biden will face as a consequence of his predecessor's style of diplomacy towards traditional NATO allies and his friendship with autocratic leaders?
Well, the message that Joe Biden wants to give to European allies is that America is back. And he will, of course, reiterate US commitment to NATO, to the European Union. He will be more supportive of US allies. He will reverse some of Trump's policies that European allies have been critical of, such as on climate and on Iran and the World Health Organization. But beyond the changing tone, I think there are still going to be a lot of challenges, both for President-elect Biden's own agenda domestically in the United States with a very divided country, but also at the international scene with crisis in the Middle East and Trump's policies there. So I think it will be a hard challenge for him to restore U.S. credibility. European allies are already have very low confidence in the United States. And I think there are looming challenges on the agenda as well, on trade, on technology, and on defense spending, where Biden will continue to push European allies to spend. So even though there will be a better atmosphere in the relationship, I think a lot of the challenges here will actually continue.
And what do you think may be some confidence-building measures to really strengthen that alliance with the Europeans?
Again, I think by setting the record straight, by reiterating U.S. support to European allies, to NATO, that will go a long way. But then I think what allies are really looking for is not just leadership, but also more predictable U.S. policies. So, they know what to expect from the United States in Europe and around the world. They want a United States that is not just telling allies what to do, but really trying to work together with them to shape approaches to the biggest problems that the world is facing, be it on climate, be it on public health, be it on how to manage a rising China. And that's where the Trump administration has taken quite a unilateral approach. And where the expectation from a European side, or at least the desire, would be that Biden would be more willing and able to work with them on shaping this joint approach. But again, the domestic challenges in the United States and other foreign policy preoccupations, I think, means that this will be a very tall order for the new Biden administration next year.
And Mr. Rowe, over the last 10 years, we've seen the rise of autocratic leaders, illiberal democracies, and, well, a general backlash against Western-style values and institutions based on the rule of law and globalism that the US once upheld. Do you think there might be some resistance to a return to a world order based on US leadership and liberal democracy?
Well, I think we're somewhere in a transition between an American-dominated world in which there's a fair amount of hegemonic stability and a bipolar order in which the Chinese on the one hand and the American on the other have spheres of influences, seek to expand their own influence and project their power. And insofar that values, order, human rights, liberal democracy, and all these various sundry questions that we've been asking ourselves over the past years and that really have been the subject of debate since the end of the Cold War, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, insofar that those are connected to or shelter within great power spheres, I think we'll see the world increasingly moving towards a G2, and I don't think the Chinese necessarily have the same priorities as the United States. So to sum up, I would say that, yes, the United States is still committed to a lot of these values. They still find them very important, but it no longer is a world in which the United States reigns supreme and on its own. It needs to work with its allies and partners to confront the challenge that it faces today from China.
Well, you just mentioned China, and well, it seems that in the past, the Western world was really hoping that China would transform into something kind of resembling a democracy by encouraging market economy principles and really incorporating the country into multilateral institutions. Trump, of course, was a lot tougher on China, but this also seemed rather geared towards trade. Do you see China becoming more and more aggressive as a revisionist power challenging the US? And how do you think Joe Biden would go about containing it?
I think this is one change in the American discourse that is enduring. We might look back on the Trump era as one in which the starting pistol for the competition, not between the United States and China, because I think China has been in competition with the US for many years, but the US joining the fray, as it were, will have taken place. And so Vice President Biden will take office as president in a different era. It will not be passing the baton from President Obama, skipping over the interregnum of the Trump years straight to his former vice president, now President Joe Biden. But instead, I think we'll be in an era of competition. And that almost sounds like a banality because it's been repeated so often in Washington over the last several months and years. But it's true. And so I would expect Joe Biden to compete with China across the board. Of course, there are opportunities for cooperation, for example, on pandemics or on, say, climate change. But I would caution the incoming Biden team not to sacrifice hard power competition, political architecture in the Indo-Pacific, on the altar of a joint climate change strategy. So sure, there are opportunities for cooperation, and I expect the Biden team to look for those, but I also think it important that we begin to compete in a sustainable fashion with the Chinese on a whole host of other issues.
There have been some concerns that Joe Biden might be a bit softer on China. And Mr. Bratberg, given that the Democrats have a strong transatlantic orientation, do you think Biden's administration might prioritize America's NATO alliance above the Indo-Pacific region? And over the weekend, of course, we saw 15 Asian economies drawing up the world's biggest trade pact. Should we be worried about this?
I don't think so. I think what Peter describes is correct, that America's strategic attention will increasingly shift towards the Indo-Pacific and increasingly be oriented around dealing with a rising China. So I think that will continue under Biden, although I do think it will manifest itself slightly differently with a greater emphasis on allies and partners and a slightly different approach to some issues like trade, for instance. And I think this will be an area where there's potential also for Europe and the United States to work together on addressing these issues stemming from China. Because if there's one thing we've seen in recent years under Trump is that there has actually been a convergence between the European and the American perceptions of China, at least as an economic challenge, but also in some broader strategic areas. But there hasn't really been sufficient cooperation so far. It's been a missed opportunity, whereas I think under a Biden administration, there is a greater chance that the US and the Europeans can align their approaches here and try to work towards a more shared approach to addressing China, be it in the World Trade Organization, be it on things like controlling the transfer of technologies, or on holding China accountable for its human rights records. I think the focus to China and Asia will continue, but hopefully Biden can do a better job at bringing along European allies of shaping a joint approach.
And Mr. Bratberg, powers like Russia and China, they were rather slow to acknowledge Biden's win in this election, perhaps indicating the sort of tension that they're anticipating with the incoming American leader. And Biden, of course, has been he's been sharply critical of the Kremlin in particular, and he called for real consequences for Russia for its aggression and violation of international norms. What do you think this might look like? And do you think it's possible to actually be able to rein Vladimir Putin in?
I think in terms of the US policy towards Russia, I think there will probably be actually quite a lot of continuity with what we've seen in recent years. I think Joe Biden will want to keep the sanctions in place, sanctions pertaining to Russia's activities in Ukraine, but also the recent poisoning of Navalny, for instance. Those things will continue and perhaps greater pressure on Russia on that side. And beyond that, he will continue to strengthen NATO, to reassure NATO allies that are worried about Russia. And I think pursue a more consistent policy, because U.S. policy towards Russia under Donald Trump has actually been pretty consistent. But there has been a gap between those policies and the rhetoric coming out of the White House, and especially President Trump. Whereas I think under Biden, it will be more consistent. At the same time, I think a Biden administration will want to engage Moscow on talks about arms control, issues where the Trump administration has taken the US out of some of those agreements, such as Open Skies, INF, and New START, where I do think the Biden team will engage diplomatically to try to work on some of those issues, while at the same time pursuing this sort of tough approach on sanctions and on strengthening NATO.
And Mr. Rowe, another tricky situation for NATO, it seems, as well. Turkey, over the last few years, Turkey appears to have been attempting to expand its influence in the region and also get involved in foreign conflicts in a way that's very worrying to its NATO allies, earning it the name the problem child of NATO. Do you think Biden will confront leaders like the Turkish leader, and how do you think he would go about doing so?
Well, he telegraphed as much in a meeting with the New York Times editorial board last December, in which he went after Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish leader that you're referring to. I also think that within the Democratic Party, there's been a shift over the last several years. When President Obama took office, the last Democratic Party president, the idea of democracy promotion and putting it at the center of an American foreign policy agenda was really not in vogue amongst Democrats because they associated it with George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. Today, however, I think the Democratic Party elites and foreign policy thinkers have revised their opinion insofar that they think the last 4 years there's been a backsliding in democracy. And so I could imagine an anti-kleptocracy and pro-democracy agenda. For example, a summit of the democracies has been talked about. There have been various initiatives floated also amongst other NATO allies like Great Britain of a D10, 10 democracies, so the G7 powers plus Australia, India, and South Korea. And then I would say beyond that, in the end, the issue of human rights, the issue of democracy, the issue of just governance, I think that tends to be sorted by correct and good strategy. There have been presidents who have taken office espousing human rights essential, I think back to President Carter. His mismanagement of the Iran issue has led Iran to, since 1979, have not exactly a sterling human rights regime at the top. And I would argue that President Obama, for all of his focus on human rights, mismanaged the Syria crisis, and that has cost us a great deal in human suffering and destabilized some of our European allies. So sound strategy making is really, in the grand chessboard of global affairs, the most important and the starting point really for the human rights issue. But I expect democracy promotion to be something that the vice president, the president cares about. And the last point about Turkey, measured against maybe some other NATO allies, it's a bit deficient in some of these issues. But when you measure it against its own region and some of the neighbors, from Bashar Assad in Syria to the Ayatollah in Iran, it's actually almost like a poster child for democracy and liberal rights. So I think we have to always remember in what region it's situated in.
Mr. Rowe, well, do you think the United States right now has the economic, military and political capacity to really lead the world out of the pandemic and restore peace and security in the world? Or do you think we'll see more of a multipolar world going forward beyond the pandemic?
Well, I sure hope it has those capabilities. And if you speak to the Biden team, as Eric and I have, it's clear that their first and initial focus is going to be on both the economic crisis the country faces and the pandemic. They've made that very clear. They're not going to be grand trade negotiations in the opening days and months of a Biden administration. But once hopefully those two crises recede, we'll see American leadership as we've traditionally understood it. I think there can be other poles, if you will, within the broad constellation of the Sino-American competition I described, but they will be somewhat subordinated to those two great powers that really, I think, set the tone and the agenda on the international scene.
And Mr. Brattberg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do you think, as we go forward, do you think maybe European powers like Germany and middle powers like South Korea or Australia will have a bigger say in the new post-pandemic world order? Do you see the world turning into a multipolar one?
I do see potential for middle powers, including Germany and South Korea, to play a stronger role. And I think if there's something we've seen during the pandemic, it is that some of these countries have taken on greater responsibility at a time when, frankly, neither the United States or China has been leading on the global pandemic response. Europe, working with like-minded democratic allies in Asia, have been stepping up, defending the World Health Organization, trying to hold China accountable for its handling of the pandemic. and trying to support a global vaccine initiative. So I think those type of initiatives are significant. They will continue to play a greater role. But I think the difference under Biden administration is that the US will now also be more supportive and encouraging of these initiatives, and probably participate also in a lot of these initiatives themselves, which would serve a very important convening role, being able to gather like-minded democratic partners in Europe and Asia around particular initiatives, be it on 5G or be it on supply chains or particular trade initiatives that these countries can pursue together. And I think that would be, in my view, the best response to a rising China and growing liberalism, that democratic countries can join hands and work more closely together.
Thank you. Well, that's where we need to leave the discussion for today. That was Erik Brattberg, Director of the Europe Programme and Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Peter Rowe, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and former Director of Research in the Office of George W. Bush. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.